You are listening to the Necropolis podcast, which is brought to you by Jason from Goatcraft and Shelly from HateMeditations.com and Metal Legion Magazine. Welcome to Necropolis! We are back today, back in black and ready to slaughter some cows and throw around some cow patties at these cows. But anyway, like before, we are here just to kind of talk about some overrated bands and not just to shit on them, but to kind of, objectively look at the pros and cons of each. Granted, in every band, there are good aspects about them. However, it could be a little overrated. So we are slaughtering some sacred cows today again. So we do have the co-host Shelly from HateMeditations.com and Metal Legion Magazine. Thank you for coming back, Shelly.
Not every band. Some bands are just irredeemably shit, but not the ones we're discussing today. But
Liturgy,
yeah, good to be
Liturgy
here.
can rap. Liturgy can rap. So that's a good aspect. Like she is a good rapper. So I'm not necessarily good at black metal, but I've seen her do some hip hop, and holy cow, she could be up there at Bieber and Jay-Z and all that. So yes, Shelly, always great to have you. I know here in the near future, you will be a father, so you will be stepping away from the podcast. And I did kind of line up David Burke as the replacement Marxist doctrinaire to fill your shoes.
And British.
Yeah, and British, so we will keep the British accent on here too. So that might solidify in the future. If you're unable to attend, we'll try to pull in David Burke. But yeah, very cool to have you here today, and congratulations on the baby that's coming. So Tyler, we have Tyler returning. Tyler is a great metal writer and very smart guy. And he's one of those guys who's very thoughtful in his approach when he criticizes things. So I'm looking forward to his input today. Thank you for joining, Tyler.
Thank you very much for having me. I too am looking forward to my input today.
Yeah. So we do have a special guest. We do have Roman from Cromlech and Into Oblivion. So Roman is part of the internet canon of extreme metal. So a lot of the internet groups, they do champion some of the Into Oblivion and Cromlech. So that reputation on the internet is really great. So great to have you here today on this internet podcast, Roman.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Very happy to be on.
I'm just joking. Like, we're just an inside joke about that internet canon stuff. But yeah, let's go ahead and slaughter some sacred cows. So I actually chose Marduk for today. Marduk is a second-rate black metal band from Sweden, and overall, I really do not hate Marduk. I just feel like they're way overrated and way overhyped. To kind of get into it, we can look at the early albums as being their best albums. Everything pretty much till Heaven Shall Burn, When We Are Gathered. That's where the downward trajectory really started creeping in. But when they're at their peak, they're rather second rate compared to their Norwegian counterparts. So I always kind of felt they're a little overrated, and they were one of my gateway bands in the black metal, which I'm fortunate that they're not totally fecal, but they are quite fecal in some regards. But as they kept continuing, the black metal, like real like nitty gritty black metal influence, definitely waned over time, where they became like more of like a heavy metal band in some sections. And by the time World Funeral came around, I don't even know what to classify it. It's just like poppy, black heavy metal, I suppose. So what are your general thoughts about Marduk? I'll start, Shelly.
Yeah, one of the very formative bands for me in getting into extreme metal in general. People tend to shit on the debut Dark Endless. It's kind of like a second-rate Swedish death metal album, but I think there's some quality in there. It's not like a spectacular album, but I think there's some interesting riffs. And I do re-listen to it about once a year, and always enjoy the experience. And obviously, Opus Nocturne is probably the high point of their career in general. I think that's an absolutely fantastic example of Swedish black metal. It's got the melodic aspects. It's very high intensity, high speed. but it manages to kind of maintain enough variety and kind of churn of different moods that it engages you from start to finish. And kind of the Heaven Shall Burn is sort of so, and then it completely jumps off a cliff for me by that point. To the point where I really don't know why they're still as kind of infamous and popular as they are. They're kind of, I don't know, just kind of made a career out of doing the same thing over and over again. And I kind of liken them to a lot of other metal bands when they reach a certain peak and they kind of run out of things to say, both lyrically and, with their music, where they just start singing about how awesome it is to do what they do. Like your Manowars or Asphyx started doing that with their latter day albums as well, where they just sing about the genre or whatever. And
it's Christ raping black metal.
Yeah, Marduk kind of indulged in that a bit as well, where it's, the whole Panzer Division Marduk thing as well, where it's just like self-congratulatory, self-referential. And clearly that has an audience because they're still going strong. But for me, it's kind of pointless and superfluous as far as like any kind of meaningful artistic statement is concerned.
Yeah, it's very derivative, especially in their later albums. And kind of getting into that heavy metal influence, I feel like that was there definitely in Nightwing and Le Grande Danse Macabre. There was a lot of just heavy metal riffs in there. And, that discussion we had about Bathory when black metal actually became black metal, it's more about reining in those heavy metal influences and embracing a more harsher aesthetic. And Marduk, they're very derivative with their black metal sound, then assimilating a lot of heavy metal influences. And by the time you get to Pansy Division Marduk, it's just like this. What is this? This is like grindcore, crust punk types of short, concise riffs and, just blast beats nonstop. And it's very incoherent and it's very riff salady. And I get the charm of it is full of energy and all that. But you look at Samath, Godless Arrogance, that's, the real version of Pansy Division Marduk, I believe, where they get the element of war and just create the most chaotic black metal imaginable. Whereas Marduk is just kind of, they can tell like Morgan, he may not be like the best like riff guy out there. And you can definitely tell, like, especially with a lot of the classical stuff that he tries to put on his guitar work, like in Heaven Shall Burn. When we were gathered, he works on Mussorgsky and things like that, and that's always been like a recurring theme through Marduk's sound, is assimilating like some classical music themes to seem like a little bit more highbrow than they actually are. And I don't think they pull it off really well. Whereas their discussion about Celtic Frost, about Tom G. Warrior, with his Requiem and things of that nature, he's really trying to reach far beyond the scope of his capabilities. But he understands his limitations, and what he can do, he does it to the best of his ability. And I don't feel like Marduk has the talent in that regard to actually pull it off. So Tyler, any thoughts on Marduk?
Yeah, Second Rate Black Metal Band describes Marduk's good albums. Their bad albums, which is, in my opinion, everything after Opus Nocturne, are, well, I'm not as familiar with their later stuff. I mean, they pretty much followed the same trends that were popular in all mid-level mainstream black metal bands, right? Like Satyricon and Watain, incorporating progressively more and more heavy metal elements. I know that the kind of popular image that's had of Marduk that makes them legendary is precisely their era of theirs that I am profoundly unimpressed with, which is the sort of like racing Norse core era, where they don't make use of very interesting melodies other than occasionally almost directly lifting like or making sort of allusions to classical themes, as you mentioned, Jason. I get that what draws people into that is the energy and the sense of rhythmic hook. But my problem with that is that those things are easy to replicate, and you eventually realize that there are thousands of other bands adopting that same approach, because the bar for entry into this band is good because it has high energy and a good rhythmic hook. The bar for that is so low. And so you eventually get like this massive sea of bands that all sound very much alike, like you've turned on a very loud air conditioner, and nothing to differentiate them, because none of them are trying to write any kind of like distinguished like melodic themes. Although, to make like a brief tangent on like Shelley talking about their debut album, Dark Endless, not so much a comment on the quality of that album, but I always thought I thought it was interesting what you said, because something that I frequently told people back when this style was still kind of popular, was somewhat at the tail end of its popularity, because it really had its heyday in like the late 90s. Black and death metal. I would always tell people black and death metal is not a hybrid of black metal and death metal. Black and death metal is old school death metal, but badly done. And it's interesting that you brought that up with talking about their debut album, with Marduk typically being looked at as like a black metal band, which they were later on, and kind of writing something in that style. But yeah, that about wraps up my thoughts on Marduk.
I remember Varg one time saying that the Swedes can never like commit all the atrocities that the Norwegians did because they're all pussies, and I always figured he was talking about Marduk when he said that. They latch onto the image and the aesthetic and all that, but when it comes to push and shove, yeah, they're not committing crimes and burning down churches and killing people. So they're not as infamous in that regard, but they kind of clutch to the coattails of that with the themes that they delve with. And before we even we had previously came up with the conception of this part 2 of Slaughtering the Sacred Callous, and we had chose our bands. So I had chose Marduk, and since I did that, we had another episode we had to do on the podcast and things of that nature. But the bassist was doing the Roman salute. All of a sudden, it was like, so we can talk about the supposed like neo-Nazism of Marduk, but I think they're just kind of edgelords. They probably do have some sentiments in that regard, but honestly, they're so second rate. I never really put much importance to what they do, whether it's in their music or political ideologies or anything like that. Shelley, you had something to chime in on?
Well, two things. One is Tyler's comment on black and death metal, and I just wanted to clarify: is that because it's sort of is trying to do death metal but relying on the conventional melodies of black metal, but then not really getting the frigid austerity of black metal? So you essentially end up with the worst of both worlds. Is that what you're getting at?
Generally, yeah. And it's like a comment on the perspective of death metal at the time, because something that you still see some remnants of is that there at some point it became like the conception of death metal, that death metal was essentially brutal death metal. Brutal death metal was like fully developed death metal, and therefore was what death metal was. And that you could look at albums like Scream Bloody Gore or Morbid Visions or even Altars of Madness, or especially albums like Seven Churches, as death metal in a sense, but really they weren't really death metal. They were thrash metal. They were just really important to the development of the genre. But what death metal really was brutal death metal. So then when you had like these black and death metal bands playing something that was largely death metal in rhythmic intensity, but with like a sense of melody to it, they were like, oh, melody and death metal? That's like new and innovative for death metal. That's not, death metal doesn't do melody. That's like a black metal thing. So it's black and death metal. And I'm like, nah, man, melody being a part of the composition was a huge part of death metal for many years. You fools have just got a really bad idea of what like definitive death metal is.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's sort of like this is why I don't want to get too far off topic here, but it's why I always hold Suffocation, as much as I love them, to be one of the worst things to happen to death metal, because they sparked like an entire trend and an entire image and idea of what death metal was that kind of, well, is one of the worst strains to come out of that whole era. But yeah, it sort of changed the perception of what death metal was and made yeah, you're right, made like any kind of melodic influence, i.e., Carcass's Heartwork or later At the Gates and so on, kind of look innovative in some way, when really it's just kind of going back to the early mid 80s to try and incorporate some of that melody into kind of, second rate death metal riffs.
It's amazing how one slam riff from Suffocation spawned a legion of dipshits. Roman, any thoughts about Marduk?
Yeah, so
Oh, sorry, I can't breathe. Go on, Rowan.
okay.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. Anyhow, what I was going to say is actually first I want to address the whole melody thing in black metal and death metal, because I actually think that's a pretty interesting topic. And I think this is something Tyler and I have talked about in the past. So at least when I remember getting into black metal initially, I had this idea in my head, maybe because of some of the stuff I heard. I remember maybe one of the first black metal songs I heard was by 1349. It was that song Chasing Dragons, and it had the single note tremolo picking in there. And I had really associated that with, primarily with black metal for a really long time. But, then when you go on and really think about it, like, what one of the earliest, most famous single note tremolo picking riffs is, well, The Exorcist on Possessed Seven Churches. So, like, this whole melodic quality of death metal goes back to its very inception. I mean, let's look at Slayer as well. There's plenty of examples of riffs like that all over Hell Awaits and all of that. So that's just a brief tangent on, black metal, death metal, black and death metal, etc. I guess what I'll just very quickly say about Marduk here is that my opinions aren't going to differ too much from what's been said. Opus Nocturne was the best one. I actually think Dark Endless is, I listen to it every once in a while. It's solid. It's got some riffs. Vocals are good. As far as heavy metal influence goes, I think you can basically see heavy metal influence going back to Marduk's inception in a lot of ways. And maybe that's one of the things that, by the standards that we're talking about here, make it more of a second-rate black metal band. As far as the early work goes, I think you can actually see a lot of heavy metal influence on, or at least some noticeable stuff like that, on those of the Unlight, on the second one particularly, which, again, much better than anything that came afterwards. And it's funny, by the time you get to Heaven Shall Burn When We Are Gathered, and the best thing they're doing on that album is, well, yeah, Glorification of the Black God, covering Mussorgsky. It's funny too, because I'm thinking about Panzer Division Marduk, and actually it's a funny thing we should talk about, the edgelord kind of stuff here, because I'm looking at the album cover now and they changed it. I don't know if you guys are aware, but you look up on Metal Archives, you can't see the iconic one with the bullets across it and the Panzer on the front. They have some much more lame version with some kind of wreath and a shield, which, as much as that was a terrible album, this album cover looks much more boring.
So Pansy Division Marduk is even more pansy. So Roman, what are your thoughts on the bassist doing the Roman salute?
Whatever. It's like you go through Marduk, it's very clear that they like to flirt with that imagery for whatever they're doing. I mean, that's not really gonna make them musically better or worse at the end of the day. It's very much kind of just an attention grabbing thing as far as I'm concerned.
Just to clarify, I know why you're saying it's a Roman salute, but let's call a spade a spade. It was a Nazi salute. And the reason they did it, I think, is very similar to Phil Anselmo, is that is genuinely what they believe, but they're popular enough, big enough that they know how to play the line of looking edgy, but not actually expressing any opinions that will get them in serious trouble. But then after a few beers, or in Phil Anselmo's case, some what was it, white wine or something, white cider, they will show their true colors and then performatively do all the things that you're expected to do on social media and in the media, more broadly speaking, to kind of own up to it. They kick the bassist out straight away. But yeah, they know what they're about.
They didn't kick the bassist. They didn't kick the bassist out straight away. They waited until there was a public backlash, and then
no, that's what I mean. The moment the footage was released into the public realm, they kicked the bassist out. But yeah, you're right. They did wait until there was any kind of uproar online, and yeah, I mean, it's almost so trivial it's hardly worth talking about as far as this band is concerned, because by By the way, if you do go on to Panzer Division Marduk and look at other versions, you can get the one with the tank and the bullet belt. I'm not sure if that's the original one or not, but that's the one that's the one I remember anyway. But yeah, it's interesting that they changed the like default one on Metal Archives as well. But to come back to the music of Marduk, I guess I'll be the one to kind of own up and say I don't think heavy metal elements in extreme metal is inherently bad. Like, for instance, the last episode we did on Sacred Cows, we discussed dissection at length in relation to them being defined as black metal, when really they are essentially like a black metal band playing heavy metal because of the way that they, express melodies, and they have this sense of triumphalism in their music that you just wouldn't get in kind of true blue black metal. Now, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think it's sort of down to how you categorize it and where you kind of put it in the sort of hierarchy of definitions, I suppose. And I think that dissection or example of incorporating heavy metal into a blackened aesthetic done well. I think those two classic dissection albums, they really hold up, as we discussed last time. Whereas Marduk would be an example of it done very poorly, just to kind of make their music accessible enough to retain the level of popularity that they have. I think that would be the difference that I would point to anyway.
As poorly as Cradle of Filth, Shelley?
Now. Cradle of Filth, I somehow think they're far less insipid than a band like Marduk, because Cradle of Filth were only ever like half-assed about even looking remotely legitimate. They made no secrets about the fact that we're a commercial goth come heavy metal come black extreme metal band, but we're after the bucks. We're doing fancy music videos with colorful album covers, and we write, knockoff Iron Maiden riffs along with some sort of, Marilyn Manson-esque imagery. Like, there's no pretense there that what they're doing is art, quote unquote. So I think there's an honesty to Cradle of Filth, and for that matter, Dimmu Borgir as well, that, only an idiot would think, oh, well, they portrayed their original, like, ethos of doing something, like, profound or whatever. Like, that's never what Cradle of Filth were about. Whereas Marduk, you kind of got a glimmer of it on Opus Nocturne, and they seem to take themselves a little bit more seriously. I think that would be the difference for me anyway.
That makes sense. There's something that I've noticed in a lot of heavy metal bands, from speed metal to death metal to black metal, which is as they grow older, they commonly revert to their influences. And I mean, obviously their influences are present even in their early music, right? But it seems like when heavy metal bands are younger, especially when they start their music out when they're teenagers, they're much more creative. And maybe they were also more creative because they came from a time where you couldn't lift influences from as many sources via the internet. I don't know. But when they get older, I don't know if it's through a sort of dying down of that creativity due to the accumulation of adult responsibilities, or if it's an issue of they kind of have a lot of nostalgia for their glory days, and that translates into nostalgia for the music they were listening to at that time, less so than the music that they were making at that time. But it seems like a lot of those bands, like, they start to make stuff that sounds more like the stuff they were influenced by when they get older. So it starts to sound more like earlier heavy metal, or even sometimes rock bands that they liked when they were a kid. I've seen a lot of heavy metal bands and extreme metal bands do that.
Yeah,
I think.
Roman, did you have something to say before we go to Shelley?
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to chime in here briefly. So, Tyler, I believe you're quoting a well-known quote about the distance between the band's roots is reduced by half every 18 months. The longer it goes, the more you sound like their influences. That's a review I think you're quoting right there that we all remember. I was going to say that I actually agree with Shelley here. I don't think heavy metal influence is necessarily a bad thing either. I was using it in the context of what we're, the references we were making within the context of this program here. But I think, heavy metal influence is bad when it's derivative and uninteresting. And when it's not being used, you can use many different aspects of genres as tools in the toolbox here. Now, I think if we're talking about heavy metal influence in contradiction to the developments, if it stops the developments in the music that death metal and black metal have made in the genre, if it kind of stunts its growth, so to speak, or returns it back to an earlier form that's not as advanced, I think that's a legitimate criticism of heavy metal influence in death metal and black metal, particularly when it makes it very rock sounding. Anyways, that was about it.
Yeah, I think that's actually a way more articulate way of putting it than what I was getting at. But I think you've hit the nail on the head. There is not, and you could say that about any influence. It's not the fact that you used it full stop. It's how it works in the context of whatever composition we're talking about. But to go back to the nostalgia point, Tyler, I think it's a combination of the two. But to take a very cynical reading as well, I think for over 10 years or so, extreme metal has been obsessed with the quote unquote old school. That's both in black metal and death metal, and thrash as well. And I think a lot of older bands that were there in the so-called glory days have realized they can cash in on that by returning to their roots or whatever, or pretending to at least, and say like, all of these younger bands who are kind of aping off the reputation of the classics, well, we were actually there and we're going to release an album that is, returning to our roots or whatever. So they can kind of ride the wave of that trend that doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon, even though I wish it would die.
Speaking of riding on a trend, we should start talking about the band that you picked for this episode, Shelley.
If everyone is all right to move on.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I wrote a note in the chat. It's like, let's go to the next band. It's been 20 minutes discussing Marduk, so we're definitely ready for something else. And we didn't really say much that's positive about Marduk, and I'm okay with that. So let's go ahead.
I have one thing that's positive before we move on, and that is, you're probably going to disagree with me on this, but I think some of the side projects of the members of Marduk are far more interesting than Marduk themselves. By that I mean Abruptum, even like the later ambient albums are kind of interesting. I think the latest Funeral Mist album is better than anything Marduk have done for the last 20 years. There is talent there. It's just, it doesn't express itself in this outfit.
Didn't it die, the midget from Abruptum?
He died, but the other guy, All, kind of carried the project on, and he released 2 solo albums. Just like minimalist noise, ambient stuff. It's not like, it won't blow your mind, but it's interesting enough.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you for some positive attributes about Marduk, which unfortunately isn't about Marduk itself. But what is your band that you chose? Because all this talk about heavy metal and such is like, I'm really thinking
that's what I was saying. It's a good segue.
This is your domain, Shelley. Let's go into it.
Yeah. Well, have you guys heard of a band called Dark Throne? No? Okay. Dark Throne were one of the sort of like most important black metal bands from Norway. And they're incredibly influential. And they released 3, possibly 4, depending if you count Panzerfaust. There seems to be a bit of a Panzer theme going on here. Of the most influential black metal albums in the genre's history. And I also really rate Soulside Journey, their death metal debut album as well. I think it's a really interesting kind of early foray into death metal, going truly kind of weird and experimental. But the reason I picked Dark Throne is because I don't want to be a contrarian and say they were never actually that good. They were, of course, incredible. But much like Suffocation, they were responsible for a slew of second-rate, kind of phoning it in B-tier black metal throughout the late 90s and noughties, where every band under the sun wanted to imitate Dark Throne because their formula was actually quite easy to replicate, the Under a Funeral Moon, Transylvanian Hunger format. But I don't really want to hold that against Dark Throne because it's not their fault. They can't control how their art is interpreted. What I wanted to call out was sort of the latter day Dark Throne, and I think the watershed would be the album The Cult Is Alive. released in 2006, where again they did the thing that I mentioned earlier, where they sort of bought into their own mythology, and they kind of thought we can make a reputation of being bitter old men that kind of hate the scene that we come from. And I know they famously claim to do that, but then they realized they could possibly monetize it and sort of reestablish their reputation as a relevant voice within the heavy metal community. And all of the albums that followed, this mixture of classic heavy metal, crust punk, some spare parts from black metal maybe, and yeah, Motorhead and a bit of old speed metal or whatever, kind of they don't just leave a sour taste in my mouth because they're intolerably boring, but it's just them trying to recast themselves as like the eccentric black metal daddies who kind of come in every now and then, release a silly album that is clearly a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and everyone goes, have you heard the new Dark Throne album? Isn't it great that they're now doing a Black Sabbath album as they did on Eternal Hails, or they're going back to real heavy metal as they did with the Underground Resistance, or they're doing crust punk as they did with Dark Thrones and Black Flags. It's a cheap novelty designed to rehabilitate an artist that lost relevance a very long time ago. And if they're allowed to release albums, of course they are. Like, they can do whatever they want with their more senior years, but the fact that they're still considered a relevant voice within extreme metal, it just gets to me. It really does.
You don't have to apologize, man. I always think it's funny, and I get that it's colloquialism to hear people say things like qualify their statements with, well, they're allowed to release albums. Yeah, and you're allowed to have your opinion that those albums are terrible. It's not like by you saying that they're terrible that you're asking for there to be formed some sort of government body called the the Bureau of whether albums should be allowed to be released to the public or not. And if you disapprove of an album, if you think it's bad, that bureau is going to come and seize every last copy and throw it into like an industrial grinder or something. Like saying that you say something is bad is not saying that you think it should be eliminated from existence. And people act like it is almost as like a straw man to be like, well, I'm going to pretend you're taking a much more extreme position than you actually are, so that I don't have to actually address the criticisms you're making, because I don't want to like accept the idea that someone could have legitimate criticisms of something I like, but yeah, like you're allowed to have opinions. And by the way, I agree with all of them. That was a pretty excellent view of Dark Throne.
Well, yeah, before I open it out to everyone else as well, I'll just comment on the character of Fenriz as well, because he's an intelligent guy, and he has some really interesting really interesting perspectives on what happened in Norway in the early 90s, and the stuff in like the documentary Until the Light Takes Us. Some of the interviews in that are well worth watching. But you contrast that with who he is now, because Until the Light Takes Us was released quite a few years ago now, where he is kind of just playing up to being this eccentric kind of Norwegian old aging metalhead. And it feels a little bit like a pretense to kind of buy into this mythology of Dark Throne as this old eccentric kind of sage of black metal or whatever. And for me, it's sort of, they lost relevance a long, long time ago. Any band that imitates classic era Dark Throne is probably reliably very boring and derivative and doesn't really have anything to say. And anything that Dark Throne has done in the last 20 years bears no relevance to anything that has happened within extreme metal this side of the millennium. And the fact that they still hold that standing within the scene as if they should be listened to is irritating when otherwise intelligent people drop everything to listen to the new Dark Throne album. That I'll leave that there, and then I will hand out to the floor.
Yeah, Roman, will you go ahead and chime in with your input before I flip the table?
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, what I would say here is I think bringing up Until the Light Takes Us is interesting, and I think I have this commentary to make on the arc of Dark Throne as a band. But what I will say first before that is the whole, when we're talking about imitators, we're mainly talking about Transylvanian Hunger. And I remember, I love Soulside Journey. Honestly, I love Goat Lord. I think even with the weird vocals, I think the riffs and the song construction on that album is amazing. And I sometimes lamented that they didn't go further on that path, because my preference in terms of taste is very much the early 90s death metal that's a little well, At the Gates, Cenotaph, that kind of stuff, but also Demulich and other things like that. And that kind of like more weird experimental progressive death metal that they were doing, I would have, I used to lament that they never continued down that path. But then, of course, the Darkthrone stuff is classic. Fenriz himself has pointed out that if people didn't imitate Transylvanian Hunger, because he was called out on this once, he's like, well, I think a lot of people imitate De Mysteriis Dom Satanas, for example. Watain would be a very good example of that. So point being, there are always classic albums and there are always hordes of imitators. So I don't know if we can fault Darkthrone for that necessarily, but going on the arc of Fenriz as a person as pertains to Until the Light Takes Us and the heavy metal stuff and all of that, I remember when me and the guys here saw Until the Light Takes Us in Toronto back when it came out. You have to remember that movie came out like 2008, 2009, something. And the interviews were, for a couple of years before that. So when you're listening to him talk, I think it's like it's around the time of Hate Them, Sardonic Wrath, that kind of era. And Fenriz is talking about how early on in his career, he wanted to make music for people that might be strengthened by, occult satanic imagery or whatever. And he's like, now I'm depressed, so I just want to make music that makes people want to kill themselves. This is what he said there. And so if you go through it, and if you read interviews and things like that, he definitely struggled with a lot of depression around that time period. And I feel that there was this therapeutic aspect to him retreating into his childhood, essentially, and bringing up all these old heavy metal influences. And I think that was his way of dealing with a lot of this stuff, because maybe the scene didn't go in the direction that he wanted it to. It became popular, or it didn't maintain ideological purity or whatever, because you go back and there's that youthful vigor, there's that elitism, there's that spirit to it that's naive, maybe perhaps, or childlike, but it's still there. Whereas later on, it just becomes mass produced music that's popular in a way that he probably never even intended. Regardless, I will tie this off by saying later Darkthrone is but I've actually listened to every Darkthrone album that's come out ever, just out of curiosity. I'm always curious to see what he'll do.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Put yourself through that.
Well, because the thing is, at the end of the day, they're still good musicians, and there'll always be like an interesting moment here or there. But yeah, aside from that, I think it's always interesting as a curiosity. Maybe I'm just picking up on that novelty thing you were talking about right there.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just come back on that before I hand over to Jason. It's interesting you talk about like the period when the Until Light Takes Us interviews were happening, because I could totally sympathize with that, because it's well documented his opinions on what became of black metal, and Varg's opinions as well. And between like him, Varg, and Euronymous is like three of the most kind of vocal voices within that scene as to what they thought black metal should be, and it's borne out by the music that they produced as well. You can almost chart the thought processes of Fenriz as he sees black metal develop through the late 90s and 2000s. So I could totally understand where he's coming from with that. And like I said, I don't begrudge him expressing whatever he's going through in his music. I think it's more, and as with a lot of the bands that we raise on these episodes, it's more how it's received in the metal community that I guess I'm trying to call out here. I think latter day Fenriz has started to play up to that a little bit. But yeah, what I'm really calling out is this kind of the reverence that we're supposed to have for these musicians that I think have kind of lost all relevance. And I think actually Nocturnal Culto had a really interesting quote on a documentary that was made before Until Light Takes Us called Once Upon a Time in Norway. I think it's still up on YouTube. It's in Norwegian, but there's a version with subtitles, which again, it just goes over the events in Norway again, but a much more low budget version of Until Light Takes Us. And there's interviews with early members of Mayhem, a few of the other guys from that scene. And there's interviews with the Darkthrone guys as well. And Nocturno Culto kind of right at the end of the documentary, when they've gone through all of the murders and the atrocities and so on, he just says kind of mournfully, I'd love to just go back to playing death metal, because with death metal, you don't have to think. And by that, he meant clearly you don't have to get engaged with all of the politics, the occultism, the controversy. You just focus on writing riffs and music and, you know, going wherever your creativity takes you. And it's kind of almost tragic in a way that these otherwise creative individuals were swept up into this much larger global culture, when really they were very insular, very kind of thoughtful people that just wanted to focus on, you know, making some interesting music. And that's ultimately all they wanted to do. And I think they achieved that on their, you know, canonical albums. But it's the tragedy of later Dark Throne, and it expresses something tragic about black metal more widely after like 1999, if you're going to use an arbitrary cutoff. But Jason, did you have any thoughts on Dark Throne? I'm sure you do.
Yeah, I might have one or two. So I actually view like Dark Throne has some pretty decent material all the way through Hate Them. I think the first track, Rust, off of Hate Them is really good. Actually, I picked that CD up from $1 from my friend Todd back in the day, because he hated it so much because it didn't sound like, you know, like a Transylvanian Hunger or Under a Funeral Moon or anything like that. But so I won that CD for $1, and I really like that first track, Rust. But I honestly hold the view that Soulside Journey is by far the best album released by Dark Throne, and that they should have stayed a death metal band, because I think if they would have stayed a death metal band, they would have elevated, especially like Scandinavian death metal, to a higher level. And when it comes to the major Norwegian black metal bands, I view Dark Throne as being the worst of the bunch. I actually put Gorgoroth higher and Mayhem higher than the Dark Throne. Of course, you know, Emperor Burzum and Immortal are, you know, at the top. But so one thing that I've always noticed about Dark Throne is the fan base, that usually like Dark Throne is their favorite black metal band. And primarily it's women that hold that view. And when I've been at shows, like black metal shows, it's primarily women who wear Dark Throne t-shirts. So I'm under the impression that Dark Throne is for the girls. So,
Jason, why is that a bad thing?
Boo, women bad, women bad.
What I'm saying is, it's probably more accessible as a whole.
So you think women like accessible music?
Yes, 100%. Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
Fair, Shelley. I've even encountered very left-wing theorists who say that an appreciation for like more popular forms or accessible forms of music is a feminine trait. They just don't view that as a negative thing. They view that as a strength.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't read all left-wing theory as if it's like gospel. I critique left-wing theory as much as I would right-wing theory. I don't want to derail the discussion, Jason. So let's move on. But I don't hold the fact that you have some anecdotal evidence on the fact that more women wear Dark Throne t-shirts means they're more accessible. I think that's
no. I have another factoid I want to throw in too.
No, go ahead.
This is awesome.
So about 10 years ago, back when the hipsterdom stuff was around in full force, you know, they kind of hijacked black metal for a little bit. And primarily it was that Dark Throne. Why? Because there's no controversy around Dark Throne. There's no murders. There's no super edgy stuff. It's just, you know, satanic occult black metal. It's like, you know, Satanism is pretty much like what Christianity used to be 50 years ago. So,
well, this is the other thing I was actually going to call out, is there was controversy around Dark Throne. They said anyone that doesn't like, what was it, Transylvanian Hunger should be patronized for their obvious Jewish behavior, and it used to say true Aryan black metal. Oh, yeah. But the hipsters conveniently forgot that Fenrir's ever said that, because, oh, look at how funny and eccentric he is, and Transylvanian Hunger is a really easy album to imitate, so I'll work that into my brand of like stale indie come post rock or whatever. They kind of forgot that Dark Throne did buy into this, just none of them were actually put into jail. I think Immortal were the only ones that were completely unstained by all of that.
Immortal is a little too extreme for hipster taste, though. Like, it's not as accessible as the textures of Dark Throne.
Maybe I don't. I wouldn't say At the Heart of Winter's that extreme. I'd just say it's too heavy metal for hipsters. They wanted
I
the
don't
you
really
know
consider
the
that an Immortal album. You know, Blizzard Beast's the last one.
It can't have that atmosphere of navel gazing. Dark Throne can, even their classic material can kind of have that sense of this is for someone with very deep problems you wouldn't understand. Immortal doesn't have that on their early material that's more proper black metal, or on their later material that's straight up heavy metal. So hipsters don't
No, I
like
guess
it.
it's just like snow is awesome, so are mountains. Fuck you. Whereas, yeah, Dark Throne can be quite introspective at times. But to come back to the music, actually, I do agree that Soulside Journey is an incredible death metal album. But I also think I kind of on their black metal material, I kind of veer between Transylvanian Hunger because I see that as like one of the archetypes of black metal, along with some of Burzum's material from that era. But I do continually return to A Blaze in the Northern Sky because it's one of the earlier of that style of black metal from Norway, but also it still has the hangover from death metal, and it has some really interesting kind of weird undulating riffs in it that they eventually shed on Under a Funeral Moon, but it kind of retains the weird edge of Soulside Journey. And yeah, again, it's probably the least imitated of like the classic Dark Throne albums for that reason.
Hey, Shelley.
Yeah.
Um,
Uh-oh.
what do you think about people spelling Dark Throne with a space between Dark and Throne? Are they poser hipsters that should leave the hall?
I couldn't give a shit. I know that when they released Dark Thrones and Black Flags, it was spelt as two words rather than one. But
That just adds to the
I don't really care how people want to spell Dark Throne. I just want to sit in my little hole and listen to the classic albums and never hear another single thing that Fenris releases, and never be told to listen to a new Dark Throne album either.
Yeah,
I'm with you on that one. Like strongly. I kind of agree like largely with your assessment. I think that, where Roman talked about, oh, there's been lots of imitators, for almost any classic metal band. That is true. And that should be remembered by people who want to blame Dark Throne too harshly. I think what separates Dark Throne, in a sense, from other classic bands that have been imitated is that they created, an especially convenient formula for to be imitated. They simplified metal to a large degree, and it was utilized like extensively. I think I saw an interview with a death metal group that was talking about how an older death metal group that was talking about how they weathered the days where death metal was being supplanted by black metal. And they said, well, when black metal musicians first came around, like we knew of it back then, and we knew that they were criticizing us for becoming too mainstream, which we thought was ludicrous. They basically had the idea like, well, we weren't Nirvana, so how could you call us mainstream? And they said, and what's funny is that in the long run, ironically, black metal ended up getting much larger than any other genre of heavy metal, any other subgenre of heavy metal, including death metal. And I think I think I saw that this interview was like before the advent of like deathcore and stuff like that. So maybe actually in the end, death metal ended up having much more of a mainstream impact because of like trends like deathcore and whatnot. But at the time, what he said was roughly accurate. So I think that in that sense, like Fenrir could perhaps feel either because he's actually been told this by others, or just out of a sort of like self-conscious paranoia, almost like a neuroticism, that like he's being called to task for this happening to black metal, or at the very least just feel upset that even if he's not being held responsible, that the music didn't do it at all what didn't adhere at all to the visions he had for it when he was a young, hopeful, teenager. And I got a lot of that sense in Until the Light Takes Us. I feel like the filmmakers outright knew that was the main story of their documentary, even down to the choice of that, what's that group called? Mum song in the soundtrack, Ballad of the Broken Birdie, Little Birdie Lost Its Voice. I really feel like all of that was intended to reference Fenrir. And Fenriz, or however you want to say his name. And yeah, I think that also explains part of his career afterwards. I do think that it's kind of perhaps somewhat out of bitterness or out of an attempt to maintain relevance, and I find it irritating for the same reason.
Yeah, I mean, it would be absurd for me to blame Dark Throne for the influence, the negative influence that they had. Transylvanian Hunger is one of my favorite albums. It always has been since the day I heard it. And it would be absurd for me to say that it's his fault what happened. I mean, that's just not a coherent view. I think the frustration I have, like I kind of said, is Dark Throne almost represent the tragedy of the promise of black metal that kind of went unfulfilled in a lot of ways. And they're kind of like what's the word? A placeholder for kind of everything that went wrong with the scene. If you ignore like the hyper commercial stuff like Cradle of Filth and so on, is the hordes of imitators, the kind of quote unquote invasion from hipsters and so on. It kind of all stems back to this entity that Dark Throne was, and at some point they started to just kind of give up and buy into it, and then say, well, if we can work some of the influences that we had when we were kids, some early heavy metals and punk and whatever, then why not just kind of dance for the circus in a way. And the fact that otherwise intelligent fans kind of can't see that that's what's happening, kind of, it makes me sad. But it's not Fenris's fault. It's not Nocturno Culto's fault.
Well, Fenris said big sunglasses equal good band, and I don't really agree with that. So are we pretty much wrapped up on the Dark Throne? Can we move on to the next band?
We are, unless anyone else has anything else. We can move on.
All right, Tyler, I believe you have a French band. Bonjour, and I am drinking some Gruet, which unfortunately is from New Mexico, not France. But let's say, Tyler, which band did you choose today to slaughter?
Oh man, so I chose Gojira because Gojira, they represent a trend in metal that has bothered me since I was for years, and that's the trend of being presented to me with very little exaggeration, that a band is innovative, creative, very thoughtful, intelligent. What they're playing is, on a technical level, very difficult. On a sort of creative level, like using sounds and chords and things that no one has ever thought of, or in ways no one has ever thought of. Their lyrical subject matter is incredibly deep and profound and difficult to comprehend and poetic on a level that is beyond just like common music. And then I go and I'm like, man, it's a lot of hype. Let me go listen to this band. I go and listen to it. Sounds like Breaking Benjamin with harsh vocals every time, without fail. And it almost leads me to feel like I'm being gaslighted by society. Like, am I going crazy, and are my ears, like, there's something either mentally wrong with me or physically wrong with my ears, where what I'm hearing is not at all, like, does not at all sound like what everybody else is hearing, and that's why they're saying things that seem so wildly out of place? Or does everybody think that they can pull the wool over my eyes, or they think that I'm an idiot or something?
No, they're weed heads. They're weed heads. They smoke the weed and they like to save the whales. So that's the primary audience of Gojira, is the weed heads.
How is Gojira any different from Tool? I ask that to you, everybody else on this podcast. Like, is Gojira really sound all that different from Tool, besides having more harsh vocals? They really don't, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I consider, what we were talking about earlier before this episode, that both bands are alt rock. They're not metal. So yeah, I see how they're very similar. And it kind of goes back to the debate about what constitutes metal when you get into like Black Sabbath versus Blue Cheer. Gojira is definitely on the Blue Cheer side, where they have the aesthetics of like distorted guitars and things like that and harsh vocals, but they don't have the gravitas of Black Sabbath, the seriousness, the heaviness that creates truly heavy music. So I think we can trace this all the way back to the beginning of metal and what was metal and what wasn't metal back in the late 60s, early 70s. So, what are your thoughts on that, Shelley?
Roman, do you want to come in before I say anything?
I don't really have much to say about Gojira except they're incredibly obnoxious and much like Tool, both cases alternative rock posing as prog rock, posing as metal. I have basically not much more to say than that.
Fair. I was almost the same in that I was a bit confused as to Tyler's like choice to actually pick them as a sacred cow for slaughtering because, like, ultimately we're talking about the music that we don't like or the music that we hate, and for me, the music that I hate, it sounds really similar to the music that I love because the reason I hate it is because it's manipulating or distorting something that I feel is artistic. For instance, like Taylor Swift, I don't hate her because it has no relation to anything that I am remotely interested in artistically. It's just on a different planet, and I kind of put Gojira in that category of like they're so far removed from the kind of thing that I'm into that I'm almost sort of confused as to why we're sort of picking them as a sacred cow. But when you kind of pointed out that you're told that they're innovative a lot, it did sort of flick a light bulb. It's like, oh yeah, they fit into that kind of Dream Theater Tool category of kind of an opeth as well of pseudo brainy metal that people think will blow your mind the moment you hit play. And in preparation for this, I listened to a couple of their albums. Thanks, mate. It was an awful experience. I listened to the one with the whale on the cover, unless they all have whales. And then I listened to their latest album, and there wasn't much difference between the two that I could discern. Fair enough, I only listened to them once. But yeah, it was exactly that, where you kind of get this chimera of groove metal, the occasional like mellow death riffs, a bit of new metal, and then some kind of almost grungy vocals every now and then. And they're clearly like talented musicians, and Tool are talented musicians, as are Meshuggah and Oprah from Dream Theater. You have to be talented to do that. But there's no drive, there's no creativity, there's no soul to it. And I did just jump onto their Metal Archives page, and they're described as progressive groove metal. And progressive and groove in the same sentence is almost a contradiction in terms for me, because to be progressive is almost like in defiance of anything remotely groovy, remotely predictable, or remotely kind of headbangable. You have to do something really weird and angular and dissonant, both rhythmically and kind of melodically as well, to qualify as progressive. But clearly the term has kind of been appropriated ever since like the days of Dream Theater to mean something much more diluted, I think. And yeah, Gojira really slide into that category. But yeah, until we did this episode, I've been lucky enough not to really pay attention to them in any significant way.
Yeah, they're quote unquote metal for people who don't like metal. So Roman, you say you don't really have much to say on Gojira. If Into Oblivion ever got like a touring opportunity of Gojira, would you take them up on it?
Nope.
There was no hesitation, just a laugh and nope.
Yeah, that's I stand by that answer. Yes.
Yeah, Shelley, you really hit the nail on the head with talking about them being described as innovative. It's the, as I put it, gaslighting effect, because I can never get a straight answer from fans, and I don't know if they know the act that's being played or not. Like if they actually believe that, or if they realize that it just sounds like alternative rock or stadium rock, but they just want to hold on to like the progressive terms so that they can just, use that as a shield to deflect any criticism. But it really does make me feel like I'm losing my mind sometimes, because I hear all of this praise and I listen to the music and I'm like, it just sounds like Breaking Benjamin again with, choppier rhythms and distorted vocals. To the point that like progressive almost seems to become just a gateway in metal music for alternative rock or stadium rock. Groove metal actually honestly ends up being kind of a similar gateway. It just ends up being a gateway for metal, for blues influences, and like alternative rock influences and stadium rock influences. You know, if you're a groove metal band, those things are acceptable. Then you're not like a poser or a mainstream band because you're groove metal, and that's like a legitimate underground metal subgenre because of Pantera, right? Except for all of us who hate Pantera, you know, we obviously disagree with that whole thesis, but that's what it ends up being, a similar gateway is my point.
Well, yeah, it's sort of, it goes all the way back to Metallica and probably earlier in a way, in that Metallica were a quote unquote legitimate metal band at one point, but they kind of bought into the stadium rock aspects of their sound heavily. And at that era, late 80s, early 90s, Pantera kind of swept the rock metal world away with their brand of kind of punchy groove metal. And for me, it's like I don't listen to, I don't really like that. I like some aspects of Metallica, but I genuinely tend to ignore it. But I think I like quite a lot of, you know, accessible rock, you know, stadium anthemic rock if I'm in the right mood. But I think I always know where it stands as, like, you know, it is designed to be accessible. It is designed to be memorable and anthemic and simple. But the fact that bands like Gojira and Opeth are kind of held up as they are that, they might have a bit more bells and whistles on them, but they are essentially that. And the fact that people hold them up to be something else is what I really take issue with. It's a bit like when we were talking about Dark Throne, is Gojira have a right to exist and people have a right to like them, but don't kid yourself that they're somehow innovative or imaginative or in any way musically interesting compared to the wealth of like imaginative creative music that's out there. It's a similar issue I take with like modern Enslaved as well. People that have never heard a fucking Yes or King Crimson album kind of hold up Enslaved as some revolutionary brand of psychedelic come folk Viking black metal, and I'm like, no, it's this awful chimera of like hacked up pieces of music history stitched together in the most ugly, like incoherent ways imaginable. And the reason I haven't picked Enslaved as a Sacred Cow is because I can't really form a coherent sentence because I just start seeing red when I start speaking about them. But I kind of,
sounds
I
like
would
you're
place,
listening to too much Pantera if you're seeing red.
well, yeah, but I'd kind of place Gojira in the same category. Maybe not quite as offensive as Enslaved to me because I haven't listened to Gojira that much. But yeah, just everything is designed to make people think that they're listening to intelligent music when actually they're just being force fed the same old warm diarrhea, but just with slightly more packaging on it. You know,
It's exactly like what I was meaning when I was saying the word weed heads, like potheads. When like a pothead says something, you know, it's like, wow, that's really profound, man. And when they're all high and shit, but you look at it like with objective discernment, and it's like, no, that is not profound. You're fucking high. Get out of here, bro. So yeah, that's my general thoughts on the highbrowness, quote unquote, of Gojira, which there is none. It's just potheads with amplifiers, you know, singing about the whales, which, you know, I'm against, you know, like genocide of the whales too, because they are rather intelligent creatures. They are mammals. Like I would hold a whale in higher regard than I would hold a shark, because sharks are pretty much just ocean garbage disposals, whereas whales are mammals and they probably have like a wider range of emotions and all of that. So, but I do like tuna fish. I know like tuna fish was like it was made from dolphins at one point in time, and now it's, you know, actually tuna. But yeah,
mentioning whale core as well, I'd kind of lump Mastodon in. I know they're slightly even more poppy, like a modern day Metallica or whatever, but I don't know what it was. There was a slew of like pseudo progressive brainy metal bands that just were really into whales for a time.
yeah, and you hear about the orcas that are killing people now, like they're attacking boats. Well, they haven't killed anyone yet. It's like off the coast of like somewhere in the Mediterranean. There are some orcas going around attacking boats. You can look it up. It's reoccurring over and over and over. So that's learned behavior that they're teaching each other just to attack the boat. So maybe they've been listening to that Gojira and smoking some weed.
Gojira and Mastodon are on tour together right now, actually.
Oh, right. Okay.
That's probably why they're attacking. It's like our bands are out there together. It's amplifying the gravitas of the whaleness, and Yeah, I don't know. The stupid fucking music, but yeah, it's kind of interesting that they're both touring together and the Orcas decided to attack right now.
Yeah.
But
I like, how's this for some metal lyrics though? I hold my inner child within and tell him not to cry.
sounds like Death the Philosopher.
That's some Gojira lyrics right there.
All right. Any final thoughts on Gojira? Because I think we've hit a brick wall with them.
No, I don't have any final thoughts. Just to say, like, there's so much music out there. You have a wealth of music to call upon. Just even within metal, even within extreme metal, stop settling for less. That's all I'll say for anyone that thinks they like Gojira.
All right. Yeah, fair enough. All right. Roman, you chose a band, and it's another one that just made us kind of scratch our heads a little bit. So you have a sacred cow you wish to slaughter today, Roman. What is
Yep.
that sacred cow and why?
All right. So yeah, I chose Borknagar. And yeah, it's a bit of an interesting one to pick on a number of levels. I think, it's funny that at the beginning of this, you talked about how, we're talking about bands being overrated and such, how we're not necessarily, well, except in the case of Gojira just now, where we were just clearly just trashing them. Sometimes, you listen to something and you're like, well, you point out the elements that are good, could be good, and then you point out its flaws. And I feel like this is actually this is pretty fertile ground for that, because, and I don't even know how many people even listen to Borknagar anymore, but I remember they were really popular when I was getting into metal anyhow. And the thing is, I'm looking at it, I have to fully credit the vocalist in Cromlech, Kevin, for this suggestion, actually, because we were talking about it before I went on here. So, but it's a band that, based off a lot of things, you would imagine would be much better than they actually are. The main songwriter, man, I can't pronounce Norwegian names, but I'll just say Oystein, whatever his name is, from he was in Molested, and Molested was a visionary death metal band. Nothing sounds like it. The closest thing I've heard sound to anything like Molested, and this isn't even in a compositional area, but just that they did a riff that sounded like them. That last Trenchant album that came out, one of the songs, what was the song? Anyways, it had a riff in it that was like a Molested worship riff, and I'd never heard that before in my life. So I think part of the issue here is the very big letdown from the previous project, which is ironic considering he said that he did Borknagar because he wanted to expand his horizons beyond what he thought was possible in Molested. Burning Spires and Mercury. It was one of the last riffs in that song. That sounds totally like something off Blood Drum or Stormfold or something. So, anyways, you have this great songwriter from Molested. If you look at the lineup of the first Borknagar album, it has it's a Norwegian supergroup basically. It's got you have a guy from Gorgoroth in there. You have, well, Ulver's not good, but you have a guy from Ulver in there. Not on on that album, you have the guy from you have a keyboardist from Enslaved, and guitarist. This, like, the ingredients should all be here for something that's spectacular. Reality is that's not really what ends up happening. Borknagar is a classic example of a band that, while everybody talks about them as being well, they get pushed out there fairly well, or at least used to, their failure is that they could be so much better, and you listen to it and it's boring. They're almost good. They could be almost good, maybe even. Like, you'll listen to the first album, and I actually, part of this is, I used to really like Borknagar back in high school, and the first album, you listen to the first song and it's got this pretty good, like, aggressive riff that's pretty long and has a non-standard shape in terms of the chord phrasings and things like that, and it just comes out blasting, and then the song just slowly, like, meanders and peters out and goes nowhere by the end of it, and most of the album ends up relying on superficial aesthetic things like, I don't know, the tone of the acoustic guitars at a particular part, or the fact, hey, I use clean vocals right here. They really like this. This is the problem here. The problem here is the songwriting more than anything. All these superficial aspects, all this musicianship that actually is like pretty good, but the songs go nowhere. And I guess that would be my answer for why I picked this band.
That's very interesting. So when he chose this band as a Sacred Cow to Slaughter, on a few occasions I had attempted to listen to them on Spotify, and each time I didn't make it past like half a song. So, I tried to do my homework for this episode, but unfortunately, I did come unprepared because I just could not stand them. And I'm saying that honestly, like I could not stand the music. I'm not into the type of melodicism and metal that they do at all. But I do have an anecdote about Borknagar. And I will share this anecdote because the person involved is now getting back into extreme metal. So once upon a time, I was briefly living up in Chicago, and I had met up with this guy named David Kincaid, who was phenomenal drummer, one of the best drummers in the U.S. I'll say that unequivocally. But he had back then, at least, he's probably matured by now, but he had a bit of an ego, which I did too. And one time we were drinking, and he was just it was a dick measuring contest essentially, where I was fresh out of the Air Force and was wanting to do some music again, and so we're talking about bands and musicians we had worked with, et cetera, et cetera. And he just kept going and going and going. And he was the drummer of Borknagar. Like, they had hired him to do drums, and he also played drums in Soulfly. But he was the type of guy who would drink and be friendly, but at the end of the night, he wanted to be the top dog no matter what, and he'll definitely show his accolades as much as possible and throw it into the face of the company that he has. But anyway, he's the type of person who would call Carl Sanders at like 2 a.m. just to prove a point and say, hey, I know this guy from Nile, and they're a big band, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. But I know now he is getting back into extreme metal. For a long time, he was really obsessed with trains and railroads and all that. And I looked at his Wikipedia. Well, it was actually in England last year because he came up in conversation, oddly enough, when I was hanging out with Shelley and one of Shelley's friends. And yeah, he might be on the autistic spectrum. I don't know, but he's really, really, really obsessed with trains. So maybe now that he kind of stepped away from extreme metal, he'll approach it a little bit more maturely. He's definitely one of the best drummers out there, though. But when it came to actually like drinking with him and being buddy, it was really, really hard to, maintain like a good friendship with him. But that's my anecdote about the former drummer of Borknagar.
Yeah, Borknagar kind of represents a certain phase in metal, kind of like early 2000s was probably the period where it was almost viewed, even though it was maybe not explicitly said that often, as a sort of fusion of neo-folk and black metal. And kind of like with our discussion on progressive and groove metal earlier, that whole idea, that concept kind of became a gateway for making black metal that sounds even more like pop music. Except, pop music in the sense of like the kind played on acoustic guitars. So in that regard, I can see why Roman would be irritated with them. It's not so much that they've had a massive impact in the sense of being in the sense of being overrated, but more so that the esteem with which they are held as being like a sort of band with a sort of a really profound and poetic sense of melodicism is vastly is a vast exaggeration of what you actually get, in their content.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that and sorry to raise them again, but I'd raise Opeth and Enslaved as kind of falling into that because they both really hit their stride in terms of popularity in the early 2000s as well. And they both established this sort of neo-folk kind of element to their music, mixing it with more proggy elements as well. And at the time, because this was at the time when I was first discovering extreme metal through the beloved Cradle of Filth, and when I would be talking about it either with people online or in real life, like I really like Cradle of Filth, and I've heard of like Arch Enemy or Carcass or whatever. What would you recommend next? And they say, oh, you need to listen to Opeth or whatever, and it'd be listening to them, and you'd kind of get this acoustic ballad followed by these sort of flat riffs. And what I liked about Cradle of Filth was like the adventure and the drama. And obviously, I was young at the time, so I didn't know any better. But then, I stumbled upon early Emperor at the time, and that was it for me. But all of the metal at that time was going in this very, I'll just call it sort of bland direction, where it's trying to dial back the extremity and kind of tap into something a bit more thoughtful. And there is space for that. But Borknagar they don't do it in an interesting way. Like I'm with Roman on this. I absolutely adore that Molested album. I think it's absolutely incredible. And I do kind of boggle at the irony that they started Borknagar to kind of build on that and expand into something different. And it's just, they've gone in this kind of sort of acoustic version of Stadium Rock. Like the self-titled debut is a so-so black metal album, but then you skip through their discography and you get to sort of the later stuff, and it's basically Stadium Rock. The vocals are all clean, the choruses are anthemic, they're written in verse chorus structure as well, and they're just anthems to Norway or whatever. And they're kind of sold as like What If Enslaved but good, but they're not even that really. They don't even try and push any boundaries in any particular interesting way. They kind of just kind of take this like crossover of heavy metal, black metal, and neo-folk and just turn it into Stadium Rock almost.
Have any of you heard their most recent material?
I've listened to True North. Is that their latest?
I don't know if that's their latest, but I heard a song from theirs, and when I say most recent, it might be a couple of years old, that sounded, and I'm not just saying this for effect, it sounded exactly like Imagine Dragons.
Oh, man.
I did listen to. I tried to listen to a couple songs from that album, and I couldn't make it through one song. I had a lot of difficulty there. But I did listen to some of the older materials. Like, oh yeah, I've heard this before, and I didn't like it, when I was younger. I still don't like it now. So, but yeah, they tap into like this really poppy, accessible melodicism that it's not challenging at all. It's fucking wallpaper, and that's what I can't stand. And Roman is completely correct. They're essentially one of these all-star bands where they have bits and pieces from a lot of bigger, more well-established bands. Like, Bloodbath started that way too, and Bloodbath has a lot of the same issues, where they create, a lot of poppy, like the Eaton song is this very generic poppy metal song where you would expect, like, these guys coming from the Swedish death metal scene would write some like shit like Dismember, but it's very far removed from that. And Borknagar, certainly they have a lot of elements from Norwegian black metal, and they totally dropped the ball in that regard. And instead, it's like they're just working on their retirement. It seems like a lot of their songs have over 1 million views or listens on Spotify, so that shows like they're really fucking popular, but it's just stale and just wallpaper melodicism. And because of that reason, I cannot get into it at all, and it aggravates me to listen to it. So I can tell they're talented musicians, and like when I knew David Kincaid, their former drummer, like he was one of the best drummers in the U.S. at the time. And it's interesting that he's getting back into extreme metal now, because if he's able to sync up the right people, they might be able to create some really fucking cool stuff. Because getting a really phenomenal drummer who's unique, like we had Dauber Beverly on here, he's phenomenal and he has his own distinctive style. David Kincaid's the same way, where you can tell it's him, and it doesn't sound exactly like anyone else. Whereas you listen to like Marduk's drummers, it sounds like dime a dozen drummers out there. So yeah, I can tell there's definitely a lot of potential there, a lot of unrealized potential, but it sounds like what they're going for isn't really an artistic statement of any sort. It's more just cashing in on the fame from their other bands, and now the fame from Borknagar being so big, creating essentially commercial music. So that's my thoughts on Borknagar.
Yeah, I think that's that's a pretty accurate statement right there. I think another reason I chose them is, again, it's a band for me that's like, yeah, the unrealized potential. It's almost good. I mean, when I'm thinking about Working Cigar, I'm thinking about the first album, and then that's pretty much it. Because the further you go on, the worse it gets. I remember I used to really like the second one, the Olden Domain, when I was in high school. And yeah, you know what? It was a good suggestion by Kevin, because it's something that I even think I ask him every once in a couple of years. Because you reevaluate albums you used to listen to, you come back to them later. Even ones that like you've decided maybe later on it was bad, and you're like, oh, I kind of remember liking it. I want to give it another chance again. So I do that. I've done that every couple of years for a while with the first Borknagar album. And as much as that one is the best one, it's still, at the end of the day, very boring. And yeah, I can't get through the whole album.
Yeah,
So
I kind of put them in league with like Arcturus. They're
yes, I would call Arcturus worse though.
I mean, yeah, I mean they're made of bits and pieces from all these other bands too, and they create wallpaper. Other than the demo from Arcturus is actually one of the best like black metal Norwegian demos I've ever heard. Definitely check that out. I think it's called Mother in Norwegian. Definitely, there's only 2 tracks, but both are really, really fucking good, and I hold it in high regard. But when it comes to their actual albums, no, sorry, this is fecal. Get out of, put some Febreze on it. It stinks. So yeah. Any final thoughts on anything that we've discussed today? Perhaps you want to say something positive about Gojira, so it's not a complete shit fest in regard to that band, or do they deserve the complete shit fest? So, any final thoughts?
The most positive thing I can say about Gojira is that, I they're so bad that they have made me forget the backhanded compliment I was going to give them. Something like, at least them being around means I can't remember. But no, we're going to end this with just something shitting on them. Okay, go ahead, Shelley.
I can offer something, and it might be a cop out, but I was listening to them earlier today, and there was one riff that reminded me of Fear Factory, and I got nostalgic for Fear Factory because they were another band that I liked when I was 12 or 13. And I was like, well, if I was younger and Gojira got big when before I discovered Emperor, they might have been a gateway band for me. So they might be, for some people, a gateway into better things, as all of the bands I've mentioned today probably are. Like, I don't think they're good music. I don't think they serve a purpose, other than just making a mess of what I hold dear. But if they do manage to get 1 or 2 individuals into quality metal, then it's not been a total loss.
So the kind of conception that I have for Gojira, even Borknagar to an extent, and like other bands you had mentioned that kind of follow suit, like Opeth and things of that nature, I kind of think that music is created for, of course, it's created for mass consumption, but more of like a live setting too, where they're able to go up there and show what they're doing on guitar, and it's really like a spectacle, I should say. For the
modern day Kiss, like you've got the anthemic choruses, you've got the chugging groove riff where the pit gets going, you've got the like the brainy solo or whatever, where everyone gets to marvel at the technicality of it, and then you've got like really danceable rhythms. Like it's all just, it's all packaged for that kind of brand of entertainment.
Yeah, that's what I really like. The kind of aesthetic I have is like, this is music made for the stage, not the studio. Studio, you want to create like the most authentic version of the music that you can, whereas up on stage you want to please the crowd. So that's the kind of vibe I get from them.
You can make brainy music work on stage. Like you can make a really authentic, profound, metallic statement on stage, but yeah, you're right, it won't necessarily please the crowd. It'll be a specific audience that gets into it, and if you write music just with the audience in mind, then yeah, you probably will end up with something like Gojira. I think that's the point. Yeah,
you nailed it. Thank you. Tyler, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as an example of bands that do brainy but cool music live and on their albums, you have things like the first album by Oblivion, Killing Technology and Dimension, Hatros by Voivod, Atheists, Piece of Time, and Unquestionable Presence. I'd even put controversial statement, I know, Pestilence's album Spheres up there as a candidate. All bands that do a kind of brainy approach that is also has interesting sense of melody and melodic development and song structure, and they don't sound a bit really at all like alternative rock or stadium rock. But then you get all the other bands that are supposedly like progressive in the same camp as these groups, and honestly, a lot more, that are called progressive and sound like alternative rock or stadium rock. But I think that they do compose their music largely with their audience in mind. A lot of like more underground metal specifically is just trying to project a certain vision and says, yeah, if you don't understand the vision, then it's not for you. Oh, well, move on somewhere else. Like black metal, especially in relation to Dark Throne, did that. But yeah, I definitely think that Gojira and perhaps Bork Nagar, and I would say even Marduk were definitely composing with the audience in mind.
Well, as an experiment, and as someone that doesn't play guitar myself, like you can find YouTube videos, either live footage or someone just playing through some of these songs on guitar, and just mute it and watch the way their hand moves over the neck of the guitar when they're playing, say, a Demolik riff compared to a Gojira riff. And you can piece together the ontological differences between the two styles of composition just by watching it without even listening to the music. You can see the motivations behind the music play out just by the way that the hand moves across the fretboards.
All right, we ready to wrap this up, guys? Have we reached our the end of our steam for trashing on these bands?
Perhaps. What is Italy like? Is it filled with old people and is there garbage all over the place?
Yeah, you already mentioned that to me before. Yes, there is a lot of trash, but I've been to Chicago and I've been to Detroit, and there was a lot of trash in those places too. Not really sure about the ratio of old people to in the U.S. Because I guess our elderly population is rising too as a sizable portion of our demographics. But other than that, it's been really awesome because this has been the first time in my life that I have seen like buildings and monuments and works of art that are older than 3 centuries. I spent my entire life in Kansas in the United States and never really went out of the state that much, and only ever been out of the country one time when I was too young to remember it. So I haven't had this experience before. So in that regard, it's been really cool.
Cool. Well, glad you're having a good time and glad you have a good internet. You're in your hotel, I assume, right now.
Yeah, I'm at the hotel right now.
Yeah, glad you're all able to join today. So Shelly, thank you for joining. I'm sorry that I called Dark Throne for girls, but I truly do believe that.
Don't apologize to me, Jason. Just apologize to your inner sense of justice and gender equality. That's all I ask. And Dark Throne is for girls.
I don't view it as a bad thing.
No, you said it was because it's accessible, which is a generalization. But you're right. Dark Throne is for girls. It's for everybody. Listen to Dark Throne. I think they're an amazing artist, but I think that what the scene is doing to their reputation is a bit disreputable right now. But
you too can be a princess if you listen to Dark Throne. But anyway, thank you for coming on, and
thanks, Jason,
from the hatemeditations.com and the Metal Legion magazine, and definitely subscribe to his YouTube channel. Very entertaining videos, and of course his podcast is hosted there as well, and I want to thank him for that. Tyler, thank you for joining all the way from Italy. Hopefully,
no problem, man. Happy to do it. I am devoted to helping out with the podcast.
Glad to have you here and have your input and have a wingman essentially for when Shelly and I diverge. And Roman, thank you for joining today as a special guest. you've never heard Cromlech or Into Oblivion, check them out. Get some authentic Canadian metal. Thank you, Roman.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was great. Yeah, and Jason, I just want to tell you my favorite work by you is Irishman in a Potato Field.
Yeah. That's a nice little ditty. Wow, that's really far down the rabbit hole. So, the potato hole, we should say. Unfortunately, I mean, it is a nice little ditty, and I don't know if you're being truthful or not because I wrote better compositions than that.
Well, I think you can. I think you can divine from the fact that I brought it up.
Yeah, down the rabbit hole. Well, thank you for checking out the tunes, Roman, and I've checked out my fair share of Cromlech and Into Oblivion. I like Into Oblivion a little bit more than Cromlech, just because I'm not into clean vocals that much, and some of the power metal. I know it's not power metal, but like more like epic doom power metal-y stuff. But I think it's very competent for what it is, and if the listeners are into like Manowar and like epic doom, definitely check out Cromlech. And Into Oblivion is more on the doomy, and they factor in a lot of different instruments in there too. Like all of a sudden there's a violin coming out, smacking you upside the head. So very cool stuff. Very cool stuff. Cromlech's new album, Ascent of the Kings, is out now on Hessian Fern. Check it out if you have the time. Thank you, Roman.
Yep, thank you. And always enjoyed Goatcraft, actually, unironically. So
cool.
It's nice to be on the same podcast.
Yeah, good to have you here. I might invite you back later if we do something similar to this. Cool.